the guillotine. When you hear that word, your mind probably jumps to the French Revolution. Aristocrats losing their heads, the fall of kings, the rage of the people finally unleashed against centuries of oppression. And you'd be right to think that. The guillotine became the symbol of revolutionary France, the mechanical embodiment of equality and death. No more elaborate tortures for commoners, while nobles got quick executions. One blade, one drop, one death for all. But here's what most people don't know. The guillotine didn't disappear when the revolution ended. It didn't retire alongside Robespierre or fade into museums when Napoleon crowned himself emperor. In fact, the guillotine outlived the entire revolutionary period by more than a century and a half. France used the guillotine for executions until 1977. Let that sink in. The same year Star Wars premiered in theaters, France was still using a device invented in 1792. Why? That's the question we rarely ask. We assume the guillotine was a revolutionary tool, so surely it died with the revolution, right? Wrong. The truth is far more calculated, more bureaucratic, and frankly, more disturbing than romantic notions of revolutionary justice. The guillotine survived because it was never really about the revolution at all. It was about something the French state valued far more than ideology. Something that survived revolutions, empires, republics, and monarchies. Something every government craves. Control, efficiency, standardization. Today, we're going to explore the obscure reason why France kept the guillotine long after beheading kings stopped making sense. And what you'll discover is that this wasn't about violence or spectacle. It was about the cold logic of administrative power. To understand why the guillotine survived, we need to understand what France looked like after the revolution ended. The revolution began in 1789 and spiraled through increasingly radical phases until Napoleon seized power in 1799. During this decade, France executed thousands by guillotine. King Louis XVI, Queen Marie Antoinette, revolutionary leaders who fell from grace, and countless citizens accused of counter-revolutionary activities. But when Napoleon took control, he didn't restore the monarchy immediately. He became emperor in 1804, creating a strange hybrid state that rejected royal legitimacy while embracing authoritarian rule. The guillotine remained. Napoleon fell in 1815. The Bourbon monarchy returned. Surely now the symbol of regicide would be dismantled, melted down, erased from memory. It wasn't. The restored monarchy kept the guillotine. They used it throughout the 1820s and 30s. When the July monarchy replaced them in 1830, the guillotine stayed. When the Second Republic emerged in 1848, the guillotine continued its work. Napoleon's nephew became Napoleon III and ruled until 1870. The guillotine served him faithfully. Through the Third Republic, through 2 world wars, through the Fourth and Fifth Republics, the guillotine remained France's official method of execution. Different governments, different ideologies, different constitutions, same device. What connected all these regimes? They were all modern states. They all needed legal systems. They all needed criminal justice. They all needed a method of capital punishment that could be defended as humane, egalitarian, and efficient. The guillotine, you see, wasn't adopted because revolutionaries loved violence. It was adopted because reformers hated inefficiency. And that efficiency was so seductive, so useful to state power, that no government wanted to give it up. Here's the detail most people overlook. The guillotine was never dismantled after the revolution because no one could agree on what should replace it. And the reason no one could agree is that the guillotine solved a problem that every government faced, regardless of ideology. Before the guillotine, France had no standardized method of execution. If you were sentenced to death, what happened next depended entirely on your social class and the nature of your crime. Nobles were beheaded by sword. A single stroke if the executioner was skilled, multiple attempts if he wasn't. Commoners were hanged, a slow death by strangulation that could take minutes. Some criminals were broken on the wheel, their bones shattered methodically before death finally came. Others were burned alive, drawn and quartered, or subjected to elaborate public tortures designed to maximize suffering and spectacle. This wasn't just cruel, it was chaotic. Executions were inconsistent. They depended on the skill of the executioner, the quality of equipment, the mood of the crowd, and the status of the condemned. There was no way to predict how long someone would suffer or whether the execution would succeed on the first attempt. The guillotine changed everything. One device, one method, one outcome. It didn't matter if you were a king or a peasant, a political prisoner or a common murderer. The process was identical, mechanical, reliable. And this is the key insight. The guillotine wasn't kept because it was associated with the revolution. It was kept because it represented something far more valuable to the modern state: predictability. Every government that came after the revolution inherited a justice system that now had a standardized, documentable, repeatable method of execution. To abandon it would mean returning to the chaos of individualized punishments. No rational bureaucracy would choose that. Let's talk about what made the guillotine so functionally superior to everything that came before. The device was invented by a physician named Joseph Ignace Guillotine, though he didn't actually build it. He proposed it to the National Assembly in 1789 as a humane alternative to existing execution methods. A German engineer named Tobias Schmidt constructed the first prototype in 1792. The design was brutally simple: a weighted blade angled at 45 degrees, sliding down 2 vertical posts. The condemned person's neck positioned in a lunette, a circular opening that held the head steady, a release mechanism triggered by the executioner. The entire process took seconds. Compare this to beheading by sword, which required immense skill. The executioner had to judge the angle, the force, the exact position of the neck. Strong men sometimes survived the first blow. Women with thick hair complicated the strike. Nervous executioners missed entirely. Hanging was even worse from an administrative perspective. The length of the rope had to be calculated based on the person's weight. Too short, and they strangled slowly. Too long, and the body could be decapitated by the fall, creating a spectacle authorities wanted to avoid. Weather affected the rope's strength. Humidity, temperature, age of the materials, all variables that introduced unpredictability. The guillotine eliminated variables. It didn't matter if the executioner was experienced or new to the job. It didn't matter if the condemned person was large or small, calm or struggling. The blade fell at the same speed every time, governed by gravity and the weight of the metal. The lunette prevented movement. The angled blade concentrated force efficiently. From a technical standpoint, the guillotine was a masterpiece of mechanical reliability. It required minimal maintenance, produced consistent results, and could be operated by anyone with basic training. For a state bureaucracy obsessed with standardization, this was invaluable. But the guillotine's survival wasn't just about mechanics. It was also about what it represented to the public and to the state itself. During the Revolution, the guillotine embodied egalitarian justice. It treated everyone the same. This was radical in a society where your death was determined by your birth. The guillotine said, "Before the law, all necks are equal." After the Revolution, this symbolism remained useful, but for different reasons. For Napoleon and the emperors who followed, the guillotine represented the power of the state to dispense justice without regard to personal feelings or individual circumstances. It was impersonal, cold, exact. These were qualities the new administrative state prized. Public executions continued throughout the 19th century, though their character changed. During the Revolution, executions were spectacles of popular justice, celebrations of equality. Afterwards, they became demonstrations of state authority. The guillotine stood in public squares as a reminder, not of equality, but of certainty. If you committed a capital crime, this was your fate. No exceptions, no variations, no mercy dependent on the executioner's mood or skill. The device also protected the state from accusations of cruelty. Politicians could argue that the guillotine was humane, that it caused instant death without suffering. Whether this was entirely true is debatable, but it was defensible. The guillotine gave the state moral cover. Try defending breaking someone on the wheel as humane. You can't. But a device that killed in seconds, that treated everyone identically, that was designed by a doctor specifically to minimize suffering, that could be defended in parliamentary debates, in newspapers, and public discourse. The guillotine allowed France to maintain capital punishment while claiming to be a civilized modern nation. It was a shield against criticism, both domestic and international, and that shield remained useful long after the Revolution's ideals had faded into history. Now, let's address the most common myth about the guillotine's survival. Many people believe the guillotine was kept because the French people had a bloodthirsty appetite for public executions. The crowds demanded the spectacle, and governments feared removing it would cause unrest. This is largely false. By the mid-19th century, public opinion was turning against public executions. Newspapers published accounts of crowds treating executions like entertainment, bringing children, selling food, gambling on whether the condemned would faint. Intellectuals condemned these gatherings as barbaric. In 1839, a public execution in Paris drew such a disorderly crowd that the government began restricting access. By the 1850s, there were serious discussions about moving executions behind prison walls, away from public view. France finally ended public executions in 1939. From that point forward, guillotines operated inside prison courtyards, witnessed only by officials and required observers. But the guillotine itself continued for another 38 years. This proves the point. The guillotine didn't survive because of public demand. It survived because the state found it useful. Another myth, that the guillotine was kept as a revolutionary symbol, a reminder of France's radical past. Also false. Conservative monarchies used it, Napoleon used it, governments that explicitly rejected revolutionary principles used it. If the guillotine was truly seen as a revolutionary symbol, the restored Bourbons would have destroyed it immediately. They didn't, because symbolism was secondary to function. The guillotine was kept for the same reason modern governments keep standardized legal codes, uniform police procedures, and consistent prison systems. It was infrastructure. It was part of the administrative machinery of the state. Removing it would require finding an alternative that worked as well. And, for nearly 2 centuries, no alternative presented itself that French authorities found acceptable. The guillotine wasn't used identically across all of France's history. There were variations, debates, and moments when its future seemed uncertain. During the Restoration period after 1815, some provincial areas briefly experimented with returning to older methods. Certain crimes were punished differently based on local customs and the preferences of regional authorities. But this inconsistency created problems. Legal scholars argued it violated principles of equal justice. By the 1830s, the guillotine had been reinstated as the sole method of execution nationwide. Interestingly, other countries observed France's use of the guillotine and reached different conclusions. Germany adopted the guillotine in some states during the 19th century. The Nazis would later use it extensively, executing tens of thousands. This association damaged the guillotine's reputation internationally. Britain never adopted it. They maintained hanging as their execution method, modernizing the technique with measured drops designed to break the neck instantly. The British argued their method was equally humane and required less elaborate equipment. The United States experimented with various methods: hanging, firing squad, electric chair, gas chamber, and eventually lethal injection. Each was adopted with the same justification France used for the guillotine: humane, modern, scientific. Even within France, there were periods of debate. After World War I, some politicians argued the guillotine was outdated, a relic of a violent past. They proposed firing squads as more dignified. Others suggested lethal injection, already being discussed in medical circles. But each proposal faced the same obstacle, proving the alternative was genuinely better. The guillotine was known. Its effects were documented. Its operation was understood. Any replacement would be experimental, at least initially. There would be failures, adjustments, unforeseen problems. The French state was conservative in the truest sense. They preferred the tested over the theoretical. So the guillotine remained, not because it was perfect, but because it was familiar. The guillotine's final chapter reveals just how deep its bureaucratic roots went. France abolished the death penalty entirely in 1981. The last execution by guillotine occurred in 1977, when a man named Hamida Jandoubi was put to death for torture and murder. That execution happened in Marseille, inside the Beaumetz prison, away from public eyes. No crowd, no spectacle. Just officials, witnesses required by law, and the executioner performing a task that had become purely administrative. The executioner's name was Marcel Chevalier. He had inherited the position from his uncle. Yes, the role of executioner had become hereditary, a civil service position passed down through families. This detail is critical. By the 1970s, executing people by guillotine had become a job like any other government function. There were procedures, paperwork, protocols. The executioner maintained the equipment, traveled to prisons when needed, and submitted expense reports. The guillotine had been completely absorbed into the bureaucratic machinery of the French state. When France debated abolishing capital punishment in the late 70s and early 80s, the discussion wasn't really about the guillotine. It was about whether the state should have the power to execute at all. The method was almost irrelevant. Supporters of abolition argued that capital punishment was morally wrong, that it didn't deter crime, that judicial errors were inevitable. Opponents argued the state needed the ultimate sanction for the most severe crimes. Notice what's absent from this debate. Almost no one argued that guillotine itself was the problem. If France had chosen to keep capital punishment, they likely would have kept the guillotine as well, or adopted whatever method seemed most efficient and defensible. The device died only because the practice died. And even then, the guillotines themselves weren't immediately destroyed. They were placed in storage, museum pieces of a function the state no longer performed. So what does the guillotine's 2-century survival tell us about the nature of state power? It reveals something uncomfortable about how governments think. The guillotine survived because it made killing people administratively convenient. This sounds harsh, but it's accurate. The device allowed the state to execute citizens without requiring exceptional skill, without creating unpredictable spectacles, without opening itself to accusations of cruelty or inequality. It transformed execution from a variable, messy human process into a standardized, documented bureaucratic procedure. This is what modern states do. They take complex human activities and standardize them. They create procedures that can be replicated, taught, supervised, and defended in legal frameworks. The guillotine was an early example of this impulse. It was Taylorism applied to death. It was the Industrial Revolution's logic, extended to criminal justice. And here's the darker implication. Once a state develops an efficient method of exercising power, that method becomes very difficult to remove. The efficiency itself becomes the justification. France kept the guillotine through monarchies, empires, republics, wars, occupations, and social upheavals. The regimes changed, but the administrative logic remained constant. Other countries went through similar processes with their own execution methods. The electric chair in America was adopted for similar reasons. It seemed modern, scientific, humane compared to hanging. Once installed, it persisted for decades, despite numerous malfunctions and debates about its humaneness. The common thread is that states develop tools of power and then become institutionally committed to them. Training programs are built around them, legal frameworks incorporate them, bureaucrats develop expertise in managing them. Removing such tools requires not just a change in policy, but a restructuring of institutional knowledge and practice. The guillotine survived because it had become embedded in how the French state functioned. It wasn't about ideology. It was about institutional inertia and administrative convenience. So let's return to our original question. Why did the guillotine survive long after the monarchy ended, long after the revolution became a historical memory, long after the ideals that supposedly inspired it had faded? The answer isn't romantic. It isn't about bloodlust or revolutionary fervor or cultural peculiarity. The guillotine survived because it was efficient, because it was standardized, because it gave the state a method of execution that could be defended as humane and equal, that required minimal training to operate, that produced predictable results, and that could be integrated into bureaucratic procedures. Every government that came to power in France inherited this tool and recognized its administrative value. Removing it would mean finding something equally reliable. For nearly 200 years, nothing presented itself that French authorities found superior. The guillotine's story is the story of how modern states think. They prize consistency over symbolism. They prefer tested methods over experimental alternatives. They develop institutional attachments to practices that make power easier to exercise. This reveals something about the nature of state power that transcends any particular government or ideology. Whether revolutionary or reactionary, democratic or authoritarian, states share certain impulses. They seek control, predictability, and methods that allow them to exercise power while claiming moral legitimacy. The guillotine provided all of this, and that's why a device invented during a revolution continued to serve empires, monarchies, and republics alike. Its survival had nothing to do with the revolution and everything to do with the cold logic of administrative efficiency. The guillotine's blade fell for the last time in 1977, but the mentality that kept it operational for 2 centuries, that mentality is still very much alive in how states organize power today. Thank you for watching. If you found this exploration of overlooked historical details worthwhile, please like this video and subscribe for more. What other historical objects or practices do you think survived for obscure bureaucratic reasons? Share your thoughts in the comments below.